The title of this presentation is Can Policies Make a Difference? And it summarizes key points from Migration is What You Make It, 7 policy decisions that turn challenges into opportunities. Again, let me just go over the logic of the course, which is the first week we looked at global health. What is it? How is it defined? The second week is issues in global health. The third week is global migration policy. What is it? How is it defined? This fourth week is what are issues around migrant policy. And then next week, the fifth week, we'll look more specifically at the nexus between global health policies and global migration policy. So this article, How Do You Turn Challenges into Opportunities, is very relevant to a course that's focusing on health policy and migration policy. So what are the overriding main points in the article? The first is that we should be looking for policies that fall into the category of a triple win. Policies that create new opportunities for destination or host countries, as well as for origin countries and for migrants themselves. The bottom line is that we should be trying to shape migration rather than stop it. And we should be doing that by looking at policies in 3 main areas: labor markets, benefit systems, and mobility itself. The article also just suggests that when policies are being formulated, we should be looking at 5 key areas: who comes, where they come from, what are the circumstances of departure and arrival, what local communities do migrants arrive into, and what legal barriers and obligations do they face once they get there. Then the article looks very specifically at 7 potential areas of opportunity when it comes to migration policy. And I'll go through each of those just to provide a bit of background. The first is immigrants and labor gaps. And basically, the article makes 2 points on this: that sound policies will enable migration that meet labor needs and at the same time improve the skills of native populations. It provides examples of foreign domestic workers in Hong Kong and agricultural workers in the US. And I want to emphasize this is not to say that there aren't some issues, worrying issues around the conditions under which foreign domestic workers in Hong Kong or agricultural workers in the US labor, because some of the conditions are not good. But the point is that in both these situations, the migration meets a labor need, and there were some improvement of skills of native populations. The second are temporary migration programs. Many of us are familiar with these, and the article makes the point that it is possible to devise policies that build in incentives to both employers and migrants to comply with the requirements or regulations of temporary migration programs. The biggest critique of temporary migration programs is that migrants stay, they never go home, that they're impossible to enforce. The article suggests that there are several successful examples of temporary migration programs that do work. They cite differences in the kinds of policies put in by New Zealand, for example, with those of the UK. But the key to this is that there are incentives, as I said, both to the employers and to the migrant themselves to comply with the policies. The third is legal pathways for migration. Again, the article suggests that there are 2 key parts to strategies, to policies in this area. It's that legal pathways for migration must be clear and accessible to a reasonable number of migrants, and then there must be just and consistent enforcement of those legal pathways. But both those things need to be there. The pathways need to be clear and accessible, and they need to be consistently and justly enforced. And examples are provided. The fourth area is the fiscal impact of migration. There's a point made that migrants should be allowed to work as quickly as possible once they land in a destination or host country. And if this happens, migrants will sooner rather than later start contributing to government revenues rather than be a drag on them. And the delays in allowing migrants to work have long-term effects on the well-being and work histories of migrants. There's an example offered of the US where migrants pretty much know their employment status when they arrive or shortly after, versus some European countries where there are long delays before migrants can actually seek employment, and the negative impact that this has. The fifth area is migrants as innovators. And the article points to the importance of formal ownership in this regard, and that if migrants have access to credit, they can take loans when they need to. They can expand employment as they're able to. That this has long-term benefits. And the example of Syrians in Turkey is contrasted with the example of migrants that come into Zambia. But the idea is that if migrants are given opportunities to innovate, they will. The sixth area is skilled migration as a win-win, and I found this particularly interesting, having spent quite a long time in Africa and seeing skilled migration happen over time. The article starts by making the point that there's absolutely no evidence that restrictions in skilled migration from origin countries has benefits for those countries or even work. And they use the example of Germany, which has begun supporting institutions to train health workers in the countries from which they source many of their foreign health workers. They've supported these institutions generally, so both for the health workers that are going to migrate, either temporarily or permanently, but also for the health workers that are going to stay in those origin countries. And they describe this as a win-win situation. Another example is provided from Australia for the vocational training that's been offered for Pacific Islanders that end up in Australia. But this is described as creating training systems for a world that moves. And the seventh area is the impact on service delivery. We saw a bit of this when we looked at the issues around global health. We'll see a lot more, we'll read a lot more about it during the fifth week when we look at the nexus between migration policy and health policy. But the situation in Guinea, where the entire health system was improved in order to manage the influx of migrants, is contrasted with that of Zaire, or now called the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where refugee facilities were almost pitted against those of native populations. And having worked extensively with refugees, I can attest to this. Too often, the United Nations and other well-meaning aid organizations create health facilities and education facilities in refugee camps or designated for refugees that are clearly better staffed, better supplied, and better functioning than the facilities that are available for native populations. And this is a recipe for disaster vis-a-vis the relations and the underlying functioning of a health system. So, the conclusion of the article is that the combination of political will and resources can develop policies that are sound, and if these policies are informed by evidence and what we've already learned through hard-won experience, they can encourage migration that creates jobs for natives as well as for migrant populations, help migrants become net fiscal contributors to their destination or host countries, maintain or improve the quality of services both to migrants and to native populations, discourage irregular migration while filling labor gaps, facilitate migrant populations as innovators, and turned skilled migration into net gains for both origin and destination countries. I also want to end this presentation by talking a bit about the World Migration Report. I want you to look at this. You don't have to read this report page by page, but it contains some important facts that will set you up well for next week. The first is on page 214. There's a summary of key facts around migration and health. Around that page also, the report sets out three clear policy implications for migrant health policy. The first is the benefits of inclusiveness, and we're going to look at this a lot during next week's readings, but this gets to the need to incorporate whole societies when addressing communicable disease control and to avoid excluding any subpopulation, including migrant populations. The second talks about the co-benefits of health-related interventions developed for specific subpopulations. This basically gets to something that's sometimes called planning for the margins, where if you design a policy or a program that will serve the most vulnerable people in a community, you can be sure that it will serve all the people. And again, we'll develop this more in the weeks to come. And the third is that healthy migrant populations cost less and contribute more to their destination or host countries. In addition, I point out page 237, which goes over 6 key lessons for national migration policies, and page 238, which summarizes the health aspects of implementation of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which you looked at last week. So I hope this gives you an idea of this week's readings and sets you up for greater understanding and success next week. I look forward to your feedback.